Thank you very much, John, and thank you to everyone who's here on a beautiful sunny day. It's good to see you, and welcome to LitFest. If this is your first time, this is one of the great festivals of Chicago, and we're glad we're getting a good turnout today and that there is a lot to do. So thank you for coming to this event. There's another one right after it. That's wonderful. A friend of mine, Rick Kogan, will be conducting a discussion, and there's just a lot to do, so please stick around. And I will definitely leave time for questions at the end, so please do think of some, and if anything occurs to you, we'll give it at least 10 minutes. This will run very quickly, I think, because I've had a chance to meet A.J. Baime, the author of this book right here, The Arsenal of Democracy. I had a chance to read it. It's fantastic, and I highly recommend it to you. It's a topic that covers politics, business. There's even some art and design in there. There's incredible personalities, and I learned a lot from reading it. I'm sort of a World War II buff. Do we have any other World War II buffs here? Anyone who's interested? I am, and I'm a history buff for sure. And so AJ looks very youthful to be writing about a subject that was really in the 30s and 40s. So how did you come to do it, AJ? And what does a young guy like you know about World War II?
Firstly, I just want to say it's wonderful to be here. I want to thank my wife, Michelle, is here, my daughter, Audrey, and my son, Clayton, who is reading The Arsenal of Democracy and is on chapter 4, I'm proud to say. I was not alive. I was born in 1971, and my last book took place in the 1960s, and a lot of people said, what do you know about this? And when they asked me the question, I always answer that I have to work much harder than anybody else who had lived through this, because I didn't. So I had to not just understand the characters and what was happening and why it was happening, but I had to understand their motivations, which meant going through their personal belongings and their papers and their correspondence, and reading newspapers of the day, not looking for anything, but just to try to, in any way that I could, to get inside the heads of the people that I was writing about so that I could understand the extremely difficult decisions that they were making.
Well, and we were talking earlier, and AJ mentioned that this book is almost a prequel to the book that he wrote before, Go Like Hell, which is also available for sale, and which talks about this incredible drama on the racing circuit. This one, for me, was sort of a revelation, because everybody's heard of the Edsel and Edsel Ford, and not in a good light. And I really didn't know much about Edsel Ford, and the relationship between Henry Ford, his father, and Edsel Ford is really one of the main driving narrative forces of the book, and it was extremely interesting. So can you tell us a little about their relationship?
Sure. It's just by chance that the book comes out as Father's Day, and it does make a great Father's Day gift. But one of the, when I was researching my last book, Go Like Hell, there was this character named Edsel who was the father of one of my main characters, Henry Ford II. And I found myself just, so I identified with this character, Edsel, who died a tragic death in 1943. There's something about him that I just loved. He was somebody who was misunderstood his whole life. He was a person who was thrust into amazing amounts of power and wealth at a very critical time in our nation's history. And people who live in Detroit and people who know the story of the Ford family think of Edsel as this extremely flawed character. He was, his father, who was this great pacifist, refused to let Edsel serve in World War I. So when Edsel was at a young age, he was humiliated, he was emasculated. When all the boys his age were going over to fight in the war, he was not allowed to, and his life began like that. And his whole life was an uphill climb, which seems strange for someone who was born the only child, or the only legitimate child, the only child of Henry Ford, who was the richest and most powerful, probably the most famous American through the entire first half of that century. So to me, there was this character, Edsel, who his whole life he was trying to create honor for himself, and that's what happens in this book, but it doesn't happen until his final days before he dies. So it's very dramatic to me, and somebody who I really identified with. And the people who live in Detroit who know the story, who are reading this book, are saying to me that they're so pleased that Edsel is getting his due.
It's a little bit of a Great Gatsby type story, and really very interesting. So just for starters, The Arsenal of Democracy is the title. What does that mean, and where does that come from?
People have thought of, historians have not agreed where the term comes from. Some people say it goes back to Woodrow Wilson during World War I. In this case, in my prologue, on December 29th, 1940, FDR, he's in this situation where he realizes that there's this war going on in Europe, and we're not going to be able to escape it. It's coming our way, and there's nothing we can do about it. And he figured out something. He said this is a new kind of war, and he figured out something brilliant very early on. I think he might have taken a lesson from the Nazis in this regard, but he realized that this was going to be a war fought with mass production. And so he gave the speech on December 29th, 1940, and he called it the Arsenal of Democracy Fireside Chat. And the idea was to inspire free enterprise and government to join together and create this, this arsenal with which we were going to have to fight this war. And at the time, it was very controversial because a lot of people didn't think we were going to be in this war. A lot of people didn't want to be in this war, but I think he saw it was inevitable. And the only way we were going to win is if free enterprise put all of their best judgment aside and created the tanks, airplanes, specifically airplanes, but not just the tanks and the airplanes and the guns, but the tents, the canteens, the jackets, the underwear, the cigarettes, everything. Everything was going to go toward this war, and that's what this arsenal was.
And, one thing that comes through in the early part of the book is just how strong the forces of isolationism were. And the Chicago Tribune was among the players in that era that were very strongly opposed to any American involvement and wanted, in fact, our headline on September 1st of 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, was Europe's war is on, not our war, their war. And that very much was a theme not just for the Tribune or for German Americans, but really all the way through for most of the country. I think people wanted to stay out. We'd had a horrible time of the Depression, and some of the central characters in AJ's book are very much of that thinking, starting with Henry Ford and also Charles Lindbergh, who plays a big role in this.
That's true. Lindbergh and Henry Ford together were probably the two most famous anti-war spokespeople at the time. They're very powerful, very well known, and very honored civic beings, and they were very much against us being in this war. Lindbergh was not, he didn't run it, but he was part of an organization called America First. Has anybody heard of America First? Anybody remember? Okay. So Gerald Ford was part of this group, E.E. Cummings, and I believe Walt Disney, I think. That I have to fact check. But it was the biggest anti-war group in the country, and Lindbergh was touring the nation giving speeches saying, we have to stay out of this war. If we get in this war, it's going to be the biggest catastrophe in the history of our nation, which in a way it was. But what I find most interesting, there's a picture in here, by the way, of Lindbergh testifying before Congress in a room much more crowded than this one, in which he said, I think that we need to stay out of this war because we can't win. And specifically, he was addressing the German Luftwaffe. He said, we cannot come up with air power that's going to be able to defeat this air force that Germany has created, that he had seen firsthand. So once the war starts after Pearl Harbor, it's very moving to me when I read through Lindbergh's papers and how he came to join Henry Ford. These two anti-war activists, they joined together to create the bombers that you see here on the cover of this book.
Well, and it took them a while to get there. And one of the interesting facets leading up to the war was how the Nazis were in some ways admired by some of the people in this book. And Henry Ford and Lindbergh were both honored and took medals, I believe, from the Nazis. Can you fill us in on just where they were there and what was known about the anti-Semitism and, the terrible parts of the Third Reich that we know so well now?
Sure. If I speak slowly, it's because this is such sensitive material to me. And I don't want to get it wrong. These were characters that were extremely misunderstood. Lindbergh and Henry Ford, they were both anti-Semites. I don't think there's any arguing that. But when you contextualize, I'm Jewish, so I'm not making excuses for these people, but it's important to understand, again, getting back to the whole idea of the kind of research that I was trying to do, not just to understand these people, the decisions that they make, but why they were making them. And anti-Semitism was rife all over America. It wasn't just in Germany. I quote one fact in the book that it was a Gallup poll in 1938 that 25% of Americans thought that there was going to be violence against Jews here, mass violence against Jews here in America. So these figures were not alone. So to understand, they were just the most powerful people in the country speaking what a lot of people felt and what I think that they wanted to be spokesperson for that cause. I'm not making excuses for them again, but Now, in terms of the war,